Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to be doing a little tier list of all of the tanks in Season 2 of Mythic Plus of Dragonflight. I already put out a tier list for the tanks in Raid and in the new Raid Aberrus, so if you're interested in that, go check it out. And I've also done a more in-depth overview of what all is changing in Mythic Plus in Season 2 of Dragonflight. It's quite a bit, so if you're interested in that, you should check that out as well. I'll give a very brief overview of what's changing. First things first, the dungeon set is completely changing. Instead of Algathar Academy, Ruby, etc., we're going to be doing Brackenhide Hollow, Halls of Infusion, Neltharis, and Uldaman Legacy of Tyr as the 4 dungeons from Dragonflight, and then Freehold, the Underrot, Neltharian's Lair, my personal favorite, and the Vortex Pinnacle as the 4 old expansion Mythic Plus dungeons. There's also changes to affixes. There will be 3 new affixes, replacing Grievous, Explosive, and Quaking, the 3 most irritating affixes in the game. These 3 new affixes are Afflicted, which is basically just an affix that spawns mobs that you have to use some sort of defensive dispel on, a poison or disease or curse removal dispel. And you have a 10-second window to do that, so technically speaking, if you're quick, one person can get both of them. The second affix is called Incorporeal. It summons an ad that you need to either interrupt or silence or hard CC in some way, and only single target CCs work on it. And the third affix is Entangling. This basically, during combat, you'll have a slowing vine spawn and slow you by about 30%. You have 8 to 10 seconds to walk out of the circle that's around you, about a 10-yard radius or so. Pretty easy to do on its own, pretty easy affix to deal with on its own, but it can have some overlap with other abilities in dungeons. Maybe something roots you or slows you, or you have some situation where you need to not move, and that can cause a little bit of overlap. I think those 3 are a really good jumping off point for talking about how class balance is going to, or looking like it's going to be in the next season of Mythic Plus. For all 3 of those affixes, Pally pretty much hard counters them. It's very, very cheap to pick up Cleanse Toxins and give yourself a poison and disease removal so that you can help out with Afflicted. Very, very cheap to do. Pally and Monk are both capable of doing that. Druid technically is as well. They can pick up a poison and curse removal, but for Druid it costs 3 talent points. It's pretty prohibitively expensive because their class tree is so poorly designed. For the other 3 tanks, nada. You can't help. When it comes to dealing with Incorporeal, again, Paladin has the ability to basically spam silences with Avenger's Shield. They can just throw Avenger's Shield onto the Incorporeal adds, no problem. But they also have a single target stun in the form of Hammer of Justice. It's on a really short cooldown thanks to Fist of Justice, about 20-25 seconds on average, so they can stun those mobs plenty too. Brewmaster Monk is really good at helping with that as well. They're able to use Paralysis. That's pretty much it. Leg Sweep won't work. Ring of Peace did not work in testing. Prot Warrior has Stormbolt, but then you look at some tanks. Demon Hunter has really no way to deal with it. Maybe they can use Imprison, but that's a longer cooldown. It might not be active or available, and they're not going to be able to hit them with like Sigil of Silence. That's not going to be useful. So that puts them at a bit of a disadvantage. Blood DK usually uses Blinding Sleet in Mythic Plus so that they can have an AoE CC, so they would have to spec out of that and take Asphyxiate, or I guess, you could spec into both, but then you'd have to give up some power somewhere else to get that. And Bear Druid is in pretty rough shape. They really want to take Incapacitating Roar. That's a much better talent for Mythic Plus than Mighty Bash, but then it's useful on those ads. Or useless on those ads, rather. And finally, Entangling. Brewmaster Monk has Tiger's Lust, and they can use that to prematurely snap the vine and just basically cancel out the whole mechanic in situations where you need to not move around, not leave the circle. Tiger's Lust got you covered. Similarly, Blessing of Freedom has you covered. You can use that and not have to walk out of the circle. But even better, you can take Unbound Freedom here and cast Blessing of Freedom on somebody else and still get it on yourself. So you're getting 2 for the price of 1. And you're getting move speed on top of it. Pretty nice. No other tank has anything that really helps them with entangling vines. I mean, Blood DK, you can hit Death's Advance and walk out of it. Bear Druid, you could hit Stampeding Roar and help everybody move quicker to get out of it, but that's pretty much it. It's all personal value rather than any sort of group utility. So that puts, that basically puts Pally and Brewmaster Monk clearly a bit above the rest when it comes to utility and dealing with these new affixes. Now, these 2 affixes aren't really all that hard, but it is a clear advantage that those 2 specs have over the remaining 4. So I've already kind of thrown this little tier list together here. Rather than dragging things in one at a time and kind of talking about it, it's pretty clear to me Pally stands head and shoulders above the rest. For one main reason, even barring anything related to tuning, Avenger's Shield. The ability to blanket silence over and over again lets Pally carry interrupts. Right now, Pally is overtuned numerically. It's one of the strongest single target, or might actually just be the strongest single target DPS spec among tanks. It's certainly very competitive in that number 1 spot. But even if it wasn't, the ability to bring a Pally and have the interrupts just completely hard carried by the Pally is huge. Their AoE DPS is also extremely high. Their defenses are extremely high. Their defensive cooldowns are extremely strong. There's really almost no weaknesses. I think their only real weakness is self-healing, and that's really more of a single target issue, like on tyrannical bosses or in raid, because in Mythic Plus, you get a lot of shielding from your Avenger's Shield damage, and your Avenger's shielding a lot of mobs. Your tier set bonus also heals you for 20% of the damage you deal with Avenger's Shield, which, again, is a lot of damage in AoE. So you're really not even doing that poorly when it comes to self-sustain in AoE on a Paladin. It's only single target where they struggle at all, and single target in Mythic Plus just really isn't all that dangerous most of the time, certainly when you have as big of a bag of defensive cooldowns as Pally has. Now, this is a bit of a turn from the past, but I actually think Brewmaster Monk is in fantastic shape going into Mythic Plus Season 2. I think they're probably the second best tank in the game in Mythic Plus. They probably won't be as popular as some of the other tanks that I have ranked lower, like Blood DK or Prop Warrior, certainly, just because Brewmaster Monk is so much more complex. But it does a hell of a lot of damage. It does so much AoE damage, and it's incredibly tanky. It's not losing or giving up defense to get all that damage. You're extremely tanky. The tier set bonus in particular gives you a lot more damage reduction in AoE tanking situations than you're getting from the Vault of the Incarnate's tier set bonus, so you're performing really well in Mythic Plus. Self-healing for Brewmaster Monks is extremely high right now. It's in really good shape on all defensive facets, and you have a really good defensive toolkit in terms of cooldowns as well. You have so many defensive cooldowns: Fortifying Brew, Dampen Harm, Diffuse Magic, Celestial Brew on a very short cooldown, under 30 seconds very comfortably, even if you're running basically none of the talents that shorten its cooldown, and if you were running all of them, you could get it more on an average of 20. Extremely strong. Protection Warrior, despite the fact that it has kind of seen a slip in its popularity throughout the later parts of Season 1, is still in great shape as well. The only real reason that Prot Warrior has slipped in popularity is just because Paladin is ascending. Paladin got huge buffs when it was already really strong. And, Pally's always strong in Mythic Plus because you could just throw a Pally into a group where nobody's really any good at interrupting, like a bunch of Shadow Priests or something, and interrupts are now fine, and no other class has that. Prot Warrior is probably the second closest just because they have Spell Reflection, so there are a lot of times where you can very purposefully miss interrupts and turn that missed interrupt that would be like a cast on the tank into an extra 250,000 damage by reflecting it. That is useful, but it's apples and oranges. It's nowhere close to Pally in terms of the strength of controlling casters. But it is still a useful, unique utility to have. Prot Warrior is also just incredibly tanky. It is actually still better than Paladin at mitigating auto attack damage. That's not really the hugest thing in the world to be proud of. They do deal comparable damage, but their self-healing is much weaker. They're much more reliant on their healer to keep them afloat. And that's probably the biggest disadvantage that they have relative to Pally, other than the fact that Pally's cooldowns, Prot Warrior's cooldowns, very strong. Pally's cooldowns, even stronger. In any case, I think all three of these tanks are all in fantastic shape going into the next season of Mythic Plus. You really can't go wrong with any of them. Now, what's, I would say, a cut below is Blood DK and Demon Hunter. Blood DK is still good. I mean, it's always good in Mythic Plus, unless there's something really wrong with it, and there isn't. I like the state of Blood DK going into the next season. The problem I have with it is that their damage output is very low relative to the other tanks. The value of grips in Mythic Plus is pretty good. There are a lot of mobs in dungeons like Freehold and the Underrot where having grip to pull them in is really valuable. It's just never been quite as good as Avenger's Shield for Pally, right? And they don't have the incredible damage of Brewmaster Monk. They don't have the incredible simplicity of Prot Warrior. Like, Blood DK is still quite a complicated class. You have really good self-healing, but you don't have really good damage mitigation. And all the tanks above either have good damage mitigation, Pally and Warrior, or really good self-healing, Monk. Blood DK is good. I would say if you like it, you're definitely not going wrong by playing it, but it does leave a little bit more to be desired than the three above. I really think it's just the damage. If they buffed Blood DK's damage by literally like 15% or 20%, I think they'd be in a lot better shape. It's too complicated of a class to play for how crappy the damage output is. Vengeance Demon Hunter is kind of alongside Blood DK, and I would say the same criticism I have in Mythic Plus of Demon Hunter is, well, it's the same criticism I had of them in Raid. They do a lot of different things. They have some self-healing, they have some good damage reduction cooldowns, they have some good damage mitigation skills, they have lots of little bits of other classes' toolkits that all come together to form something that just doesn't quite have enough unique utility. I like aspects of Vengeance Demon Hunter, and it has recently just gotten a pretty good size buff to its single target damage. The problem with it is its AoE damage is still average, mid, and that really hasn't been buffed. It's sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, and that's really the problem with the class. They don't really have a good AoE defensive cooldown. They have Fiery Brand, which they can spread around, but that's not really the same as like a surefire demoralizing shout or Eye of Tyr. They don't have any sort of personal defensive cooldowns that they can hit that are on kind of a short mid cooldown like Celestial Brew or even Dampen Harm. They just need like one more thing added to their kit, and I'm not exactly sure what it is, but someone at Blizzard should be. And finally, we have Bear Druid, and I think Bear Druid is definitely a step below even Blood DK and Demon Hunter. They basically suffer from the thing that Demon Hunter and Blood DK are both really good at. These two guys here in the A tier, the cut above Bear, they have great self-healing, and they kind of lack damage reduction or damage output, or they just don't have quite enough coming together perfectly in their kit to compensate for their shortcomings. But they do have good self-healing. Bear basically has no self-healing. Frenzied Regen is a horrendous self-heal. I think literally the worst tank self-heal in the entire game. It's like, it's a health stone on a 30-second cooldown, but it's as a hot. That's just not good enough for how much damage tanks take. I mean, by comparison, Brewmaster Monk has Expel Harm, which is a better heal on a 0.5 second global cooldown on a 5 second total cooldown. And again, better heal than Frenzied Regen, which is 36 seconds base. Even if you have cooldown or talents reducing the cooldown and you have haste affecting it and all, it's still over 20 seconds, considerably over 20 seconds. And again, worse than Expel Harm. That's not good. Worse than Word of Glory. Worse than Impending Victory for Warrior. Certainly worse than any of the heals that DK and DH have. That's a huge issue. This is also compounded by the fact that Bear Druid takes a lot of spell damage, and while they did recently, or somewhat recently, receive a buff to Bark Skin, just a reduction of its cooldown by 15 seconds baseline, which was pretty good, and a modest increase to their mastery, which increases their max health and their healing taken, it's just not quite enough. They need some sort of either just baseline damage reduction against spell damage, or maybe even more uptime on Bark Skin, like a buff to talent that increases the duration of Bark Skin, make it, instead of 4 extra seconds on Bark Skin, make it like 6 or 8. Something to compensate for how easily they get just demolished by spell damage. You know, until they have some way of compensating for spell damage, be it like more consistent self-healing or more just outright damage reduction against spell damage, Bear Druid is going to suffer. That being said, their damage is pretty good. I like Bear Druid for non-challenging keys, and I actually think it's quite a bit more fun than these two tanks here, kind of in the middle, for like, you know, keys right at the 20 range once you have a fair amount of gear and you're doing stuff that's not all too challenging. Let's say probably like more like 10s in the first week of the season, but you know, kind of lower challenging keys that are just sort of more breezy and casual and fun. I really do think Bear is quite enjoyable just because it slams. It's just that once you get into more challenging content, its weaknesses defensively become extremely apparent, and it gets absolutely shredded by spell damage and can't make up for it with any sort of self-healing. Alrighty, well, I think that about covers it. What can I say? Paladin stocks are through the roof. It's so fun to play. A lot of people complaining about how good Paladin is, or complaining about people talking about how good Paladin is, and I have no complaints about Paladin. I love playing it. It's incredibly fun. It's always been the most fun tank in Mythic Plus, probably. Just the ability to crowd control or lock down all the casters with Avenger Shield is so awesome. Who could complain about that? Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.